Thanks everyone so much for joining this. It's the equity panel, but there's an actual title to it, which is Road Safety, Equity, and Public Engagement in the DC region. Thanks so much for being here. We have a really great panel today. My name is Alex Baca. I'm the DC Policy Director at Greater Washington. And just to keep things running smoothly, instead of going around and doing introductions, because I think we have a lot to get to. I want to welcome Christine Baker from Arlington County, Alex Carroll from the city of Alexandria, Wade Holland from Montgomery County, Christine Mayeur from Washington, DC, and Victor Weissberg from Prince George's County, who will all speak in particular ways about their roles, because I prepared a bunch of questions and I'm super excited to hear their responses. So when we were preparing for this panel, it seemed to make sense to start from the top of what equity is. So this is the US DOT, Department of Transportation, federal guidelines for equity in transportation, which I think is both a good definition and also insanely broad and kind of hard to understand. Well, I think there's some really good stuff in here. I do think it's important to facilitate social and economic opportunities by providing equitable levels of access based on the needs of populations being served. What that means in practice is obviously not always going to map super tightly onto the language that exists here, but this matters because it is the federal standard. But we do have regional equity emphasis areas, right? Like their planning concept, the Council of Governments put them out in the world after a lot of work. And that, because we have a sort of grant making structure that flows down from the federal government through COG that impacts local jurisdictions, these equity emphasis areas, are facilitate equity in practice. So I pulled the map over. I think you can probably guess, right? There's a heavy emphasis on the eastern side of the region. Unsurprisingly, we have one map. Those are sort of what those are. I wanted to pull that all up before we got into the questions and just give a really high level overview of this, because I think too often I've been on panels about equity. I know our panelists have been on panels about equity, where it's really easy to just dive into the project level and start talking about all the really cool things that different jurisdictions are doing. And that's both really important and reflective of those federal and regional standards for equity and how they work, but also I think doesn't get into the sort of sticky stuff that you see on the ground, right? And as we were preparing for this, we did talk about who is typically attending these panels, who is attending the Vision Zero Summit. And in order to make it useful for all of you, I think what I've urged our panelists to focus on is even starting with both defining equity, but also talking about how it works. And so given that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over and open this discussion. I'm gonna pick one of you to start if you want. Victor, you're the first person I can see. Can you kick us off and talk about what equity means for Prince George's? You are on mute.
Certainly, thanks, Alex. And I provided some slides, or if you can sort of bring those up, that would be great.
Yep.
And is that so?
I'm going to start you here.
Oh, okay. But so obviously, as Alex pointed out, there's a preponderance of the equity emphasis areas on the eastern side of the region. I'll sort of back up sort of before this slide, but talk a little bit about building off of the federal and regional statements about equity, but as part of COG's Visualize 2045, they did some analyses looking at both commute times broken down within the region for both vehicles and for transit, and the vehicular commute is going to be much greater for those coming from the eastern side of the region which also overlays with where equity is the biggest issue. And then, so our approach to Vision Zero is to emphasize the areas of greatest need, of greatest equity concern, but looking at our high injury network. And as you can see, the high injury network, which is the slide or the picture on the left, shows both the overall, which are the ones in deeper red, and then the ones in orange are on county roads. But the preponderance of the HIN, actually 19 out of the top 20 happen to be on state roads. And the other overlay is on the right. You can see that there is a pretty direct overlay of where those HINs are and the equity emphasis areas. So next slide. So our focus has been to drill down on the areas where crashes are most severe, and also where access improvements are needed to better get to public transportation and activity centers. We were fortunate enough to get the first Safe Streets for All award, and that contains 7 sub-projects. 5 of those are actually within the sort of watershed for what will be the purple line. But they also overlay with equity emphasis areas. The other 2 are Sheriff Road and Marlboro Pike. And Marlboro Pike has long been, and that's the one county road that has always been on the top 10 list of crashes and fatalities in the county. So we're really focusing in our resources on those areas, which also happen to be equity areas. Next slide. The other big initiative and the flagship for our county executive is the Blue Line Corridor. And another overlay between equity and safety is how can you target those areas for economic development and focus in on safer and better access in those areas. And the flagship project for the county is emphasizing the areas around the stations on the Blue Line, and that's Largo, Morgan Boulevard, Addison Road, Seat Pleasant, and Capitol Heights. So we're targeting several micro projects in and around each of those stations to provide safer access. Next slide. This just elaborates. We went on a pedestrian road safety audit in the Blue Line Corridor area and identified improvements that we thought could improve things. As Alex mentioned, it's one thing to make pronouncements about equity but where sort of the rubber, meets the road, forgive the pun, is, in your outreach. And we have really tried to go the extra mile on reaching out to communities that often are not, the ones who automatically show up at public meetings and the sort of the standard outreach fare. So we've really tried to focus in on events in different and diverse communities. So we set up tables at, several of the more highly attended national night outs, which is coming up in July. There's a seniors walk group that has started. One thing that we're doing through a Maryland Highway Safety Office grant is a testimonial wall that's part of the Street Smart campaign, and we are staffing that and having that on display with a video and outreach materials. We went to the community college this week. We're at the Motor Vehicle Administration in Beltsville. We're going to be going to Largo, and we're targeting 5 high schools for that campaign. So I could go on about our outreach effort, but we really are trying to reach different targeted, diverse, and sort of equity emphasized communities. And our campaign is built around the E's of Vision Zero, and in addition to the traditional 4, we also have really emphasized equity and evaluation as a 5th and 6th E to really round out and have a comprehensive program.
Cool.
And
I think those are your slides, which I very much appreciate. One thing I wanted to probe a little bit is what does it mean? And I think you kind of answered this, but just in summary, what does it mean for the county's resources to be put into projects, or into, now that you've identified where things need to happen, what does it mean to put resources into them?
And I think, and one of the principles of Vision Zero is, is following the data. And that's good for a lot of reasons, but it's also good for what, are often, scant resources, and really focusing them on where the data shows the problems are the most significant. But also doing that through an equity lens. So using the data, but then also looking at the different equity factors, and taking and really zeroing in our resources, applying them through that lens.
Great, thank you. Alex, I think you're the next person in my line of sight. If you want to go ahead, I will find your slides in here.
Yeah, you don't need to find my slides, Alex. Thank you so much. In terms of what equity means for our jurisdiction in Alexandria, in 2021, the city adopted an all Alexandria resolution. And the purpose of this was really just to center race and social equity into all of our planning processes, systems, decision-making, what have you, just in general for city government. And this can look different for different disciplines. So for transportation in particular, it's really about recognizing the inequities and how people are impacted by our transportation system, the amount of access that they have to different resources, the safety outcomes of past planning decisions, past project decisions. And it's really just about taking an intentional approach to sort of righting those past wrongs and not ensuring equality, but providing people the opportunities that they need, the resources that they need, the programming and projects that they need to succeed and thrive in the city. So from a transportation lens, it's looking at where higher density of crashes, correlates with historically underserved neighborhoods, and sort of recognizing that there tends to be a higher rate of crashes in those neighborhoods, and what can we do to really right those wrongs and to reverse that trend.
Great.
I know the rest of our panel has a lot to share on this, so I'll pause there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Christine Baker, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So for Arlington, an equitable Arlington is one where all people are valued, educated, healthy, and safe, regardless of their race, income, ability, or any other demographic. So kind of getting to your question, Alex, we view it as a verb. And, we're making sure that all people have access to safe transportation and no particular demographic or neighborhood is overrepresented when it comes to crashes. So equity in Vision Zero really looks like project prioritization in underserved neighborhoods, making sure that projects from louder or more affluent neighborhoods aren't jumping the queue. That's really important. And it looks like engagement, out in the community, as Victor, kind of demonstrated, meeting people where they are to make sure everyone has a say in transportation safety in the community. So our baseline was recently established through our transportation safety equity analysis. We did a really robust analysis of crash data, as well as community reports, things that are coming into us, which really kind of helps set some of the programming when we identify a safety issue through something that comes in through the community. We also looked at hospital data and a couple other data sources, but the analysis confirmed that there are neighborhoods in Arlington that have historically been overrepresented in crash data and underrepresented in responses to transportation related safety requests. And that really lies within the equity areas that we have identified. So the recommendations from this study are kind of being looped into our Vision Zero program. And that's really emphasizing being proactive in addressing infrastructure needs with an equity lens, creating a platform to prioritize safety projects in underserved neighborhoods, and ensuring that reporting channels are clear and accessible to all community members. And we're going to track that progress over time towards all these goals, to make sure that we are moving towards that equity piece. And then you can jump to the next slide. To show this in demonstration, on the right side of the slide, we've got our hotspots. And we not only look at hotspots countywide, but we also focus in on hotspots specifically in the equity emphasis areas. And that allows us to be more proactive in finding issues that might be overlooked, and making sure that we are prioritizing investment and analysis in those areas. And on the left side of the slide, we have our high injury network, which covers 52% of all of our injury crashes on only 6.8% of roadways. So we are trying to tackle, again, those most severe crashes and really prioritize, make sure we're not just being responsive, but being proactive in addressing our safety needs. And then next slide, we do host a specific safety engagement countywide every year, and it's to learn about people's safety issues. And we make sure we get out into our equity areas specifically. We're on the ground, we're meeting people where they are to get that feedback. And we also have a clickable map, and we go back to this when we do high injury network audits, when we do systemic analysis around crashes or safety issues. And we look at it, when we're investigating hotspots. So it's a way that we can keep going back to a point in our community engagement that we know we reached a lot of different people who we might not have heard from otherwise. So with that, I will hand it off to the next person, Alex.
Other Christine Mayeur, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I won't restate what others have said. So Carroll from Alexandria and Christine covered it pretty well for DC. We established our racial equity office in 2021 with the REACH Act. And so we're taking a process like a GARE process, which is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity approach. So to sort of like a change management form of adding equity to everything that we do, especially Vision Zero, to normalize it, organize around it, operationalize it, and then assess how we're doing, and all of this with racial equity training going throughout that. And then in Vision Zero, we looked at a comparison over time by ward, overlaying our race and ethnicity index score from Move DC, which is our long-range transportation plan for those not familiar with DC, and saw this disproportionate impact for our communities of color, which tracks with national research showing that Black, Indigenous, people of color, low income populations and populations experiencing poverty or unhoused are impacted more by fatal and serious crashes. So for DC, centering equity in the plan means prioritizing, like everyone else, prioritizing investments in our transportation system in those neighborhoods to rectify past disinvestment. Yeah, I'll
operationalizing later if you want.
yeah.
Perfect. Wade, I think tell us what equity means in Montgomery County.
Yeah, I think I'll take it. Don't want to restate what everyone else says. You see, we're kind of all using similar models, especially at Montgomery County. We also use the GARE model, which again is the Government Alliance on Racial Equity model for equity throughout the county. So there's countywide initiative. That was a countywide law that was passed in late 2019 after a couple year effort to really build a new racial equity and social justice policy for the county that includes, as Christine mentioned, it's training for all county employees on racial equity, looking at all the new laws, what's the racial equity impact of those new laws, what's the racial impact of our budget decisions as well. Taking it down a level to Vision Zero, we had a racial equity and social justice task force that was worked throughout 2019, kind of almost parallel with the overall countywide efforts to look at our Vision Zero efforts that we had to date and make recommendations as we were transitioning from our short-term Vision Zero action plan to our longer-term Vision Zero action plan. Because my goal was, I didn't feel like equity was really centered as much as it should have been in our first plan. It needed to be, before we even started talking about the long-term plan, I want to say, let's hold on that. Let's talk strictly about equity and then build that into our Vision Zero efforts. And there's a definition in the Vision Zero the Vision Zero Equity Task Force Plan. You can read that on the website. I don't want to read that off for you. But what it really means to me when I look at the equity report that the task force put together, and that task force was community members as well as county staff, and our Vision Zero action plan was really, to me, for equity is, am I solving an actual need or am I fulfilling a wish? So a lot of times when these projects get built, especially if they're really community driven, it's going to be a great project. We don't build bad projects in Montgomery County, but does it actually solve a problem that we know exists? So on the slide, you can see our high injury network, and very similar to all the other jurisdictions in the area and nationwide. I've read a lot of Vision Zero action plans and stole from them over time to build our action plan. And you never see the issues in terms of serious and fatal crashes. They're usually not in your most wealthier areas of your community. I've yet to see a plan that shows that, and shows why if you don't really center equity in your work, you're actually never going to start making a dent in your Vision Zero, towards your Vision Zero goal, and reducing those serious and eventually eliminating those serious and fatal crashes.
Yeah. No, and I take your point. I think you have a good point. We've talked about this, obviously, of like wealthy neighborhoods don't see traffic crashes. And so I do want to please put stuff in the chat. I'm kind of checking periodically because I'm sharing my screen. So I will check when I can. But one of the reasons that I wanted everyone to run through just like, what does equity mean? What does it look like? Is, first of all, I learned in preparing for this panel that all of the jurisdictions represented here have higher injury networks, which is a really important next step to Vision Zero goals. That those things exist and are being planned around is pretty awesome. And even I didn't realize the extent to which that had been integrated into the work of these different jurisdictions. And also the rightful sort of question being proposed of like, this is a panel on equity and all the presenters are white. Equity and traffic safety is not solely racial equity, though, and that's not an excuse for sure. But I would say that this has been one of the more like challenging areas to work on, in part because it isn't, while it in many ways is clearly delineated by race, there's a lot of other things going on, including sort of the obviously economic conditions that track with where racial gaps are, but also I would say how political power accrues to people who drive and how political power accrues to people who don't. So I'm here with a bunch of people who work for jurisdictions. They are staff. There is actually a slide in here where I'm going to ask them to talk about what it means to be a staffer more so than a elected or appointed decision maker. But, you know, there's a lot of stuff swirling around this, and a lot of it does tend to be political, centered around power. And even though, like, I am talking to jurisdiction and staff who cannot necessarily, I think, talk about the political decisions that their bosses may make, you know, I can, right? This is why Greater Washington is a C4, and we do endorse on the basis of traffic safety for this reason, because it is a political issue. And that power differential is definitely racialized. It is definitely influenced by economic conditions. There's gender equity. There's a lot of stuff going into this, but I think the spatial and geographic features of transportation planning, which you were able to just see in some of the panelist slides, did a good job at showing how interrelated and intersectional so much of this is. It is up to you as to whether you want to judge why the people who work on Vision Zero in certain jurisdictions are white. And, you know, the choice to have a white panelist is up for judgment. And I welcome that. But I would say that there is both a like very bright line of racial equity in this conversation, as well as the power structures and differentials that happen also in the process of planning these projects. So Christine Baker got into this a little bit, but, you know, one of the things that has always struck me is like, when talking about equity in projects is like, the word gets used in a bunch of different ways. So I think it would be helpful to hear from each of you is like, how are you treating equity? I have examples as like a noun, a verb, or an adjective, you know, but can you talk a little bit about what it means to talk about equity for the purposes of planning? Wade, if you want to start, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, and to go back to your previous question about, you know, the diversity on this panel, that's also just something beyond even our government, just our industries we need to work on, is getting, you know, especially more women into engineering and planning, as well as non-white folks into these positions. As you said, it just happens to be that we're the people who are running these programs and leads for our jurisdictions, but it's kind of an industry-wide thing that we wanted to work on. That's where it's great seeing some of these groups that are standing up to really get more women engaged in engineering. Even local groups as well as planning. But thank you for acknowledging that. To go back to the question posed, how do we treat equity? So there's kind of at the policy planning and project level. So the policy, we talked about the Vision Zero goals. We talked about the county-wide or jurisdiction-wide goals around racial equity. That sets, you know, the very high level. What do we mean by equity? And that helps us as staff say, okay, this is what you as the elected officials we're in charge want to see. That helps us inform those policies. So in the Vision Zero action plan, we actually rate every one of the 45 action items on a racial equity and social justice score, 1 to 3. There's other scoring in terms of accessibility, how does improve accessibility for people with disabilities, crash impact, how much will this actually reduce serious and fatal crashes, and then also the investment, how much will that cost to implement for that action item over time. So that's kind of the higher level Vision Zero policy. The planning, and one of the things I really have seen, and Vic mentioned this for grants, is grants from the regional government, state government, and federal government are really centering equity on their proposals. You don't have that. You're not in your proposal, it's showing how it's going to invest in traditionally disadvantaged communities. You're not going to have a strong proposal anymore. Even 3-4 years ago, that's not true. Those programs are really reformed, showing, you know, we talked about the equity emphasis areas a lot so far. The reasons why we talk about those a lot, if we don't put in those equity emphasis areas into our proposal for COG, it's not going to rank as highly as other proposals that will be putting investments into those traditionally underrepresented neighborhoods. So that's where the grant process has really changed for us, and makes those communities that are traditionally disinvested actually finally now getting prioritized in ways they hadn't before. In terms of the project level, you know, it's making sure that if we're doing outreach on a project, it's meeting people where they are. You know, not everyone can go to a 7 p.m. meeting on a Tuesday that's at a middle school. some people love going to those, and we have great engagement at those meetings. Those will continue, but it's also going to grocery stores, it's going to shopping centers, it's going to, I was at a high school during lunchtime to get feedback from high schoolers in an area we were doing project just last week. So we're finding all sorts of great ways, going to communities events, even if they're held by like maybe the local church or county sponsored community events. Those are all great places to get people where they're at.
Yeah, Alex, do you want to talk a little bit more about what equity sort of how you operationalize it, or also like how you would describe it in Alexandria?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you used the perfect word there, which is operationalize. It has to be a conscious action. And I think what we've really tried to do in the city of Alexandria is not just treat equity as a goal or treat it as like a separate initiative. It really has to transcend every effort that we undertake and every decision that we make. It has to be incorporated and centered into all of our processes. So, you know, some examples of how we've done that in the city is like when, and Wade touched on this particularly with grant applications and the new Safe Streets and Roads for All program, for example, is really using the equity lens to guide your decision making on what projects you want to do. So a lot of times when we talk about equity, you know, obviously there's economic equity, there's racial equity, social equity, all these things, and they tend to be based in certain geographic pockets of our city. So it's looking at what areas of the city are we doing our projects. Is there a reasonable balance between the amount of money that we're investing in historically underserved areas versus not? And it's not just about how much money you're investing, it's what kinds of projects are you doing in those neighborhoods. So it's thinking about, you know, the scope of each project that you're doing. Is it really meeting the needs of the people in that particular community? So for example, you know, if you're doing a highway widening project in a neighborhood that has a high rate of people who don't have access to a vehicle, are you really serving that community? So it's not just about the dollar amount, it's also about the outcomes of the projects that you're undertaking. Wade touched a lot on what I would also say related to outreach is making sure that we're hearing from a good cross section of quote unquote the community, you know, because we do tend to have very vocal residents who aren't necessarily representative of the community as a whole. So how do we change our outreach approaches to make sure that we're hearing from the folks that we don't typically hear from in these processes, and or how are their views different from the folks that we typically hear from at your usual public meeting at City Hall or something like that. You know, so it's really focused on centering equity as part of those conversations around where we're doing projects, what projects we say yes to, what those projects look like, and how we're engaging people.
Victor, do you want to talk a little bit more about operationalizing?
Sorry. Yeah, so you know, like Wade and you know, and the previous speakers just noted, you know, we really, you know, put equity through the sort of the fabric of everything that we do, as Wade pointed out, and especially since, you know, so many of our projects are driven by what we can leverage and achieve through grants. So fortunately, that process also has equity as front and center if you want to be competitive. And so we've integrated all of that, and you know, also not just relying on the virtual meeting or the sort of the traditional methods of outreach, but really trying to go out into communities where where equity is the most most clear, and trying to reach out to more diverse audiences and groups that wouldn't necessarily come to you if you were to just put something on a website. So it's really looking at how do you integrate equity into everything that you're doing, and we try to. The other thing that I'll add is looking at transportation projects as not in a silo, looking at it through the equity lens, the safety lens, and resilience, but also land, how does transportation and land use mix and overlay and meet those other objectives. So that's why projects like what we're emphasizing in the Blue Line corridor hopefully will address equity, will address resilience, because if more people have safer access to transit and there are more jobs on the eastern side of the region, all of that creates a synergy that hopefully will benefit equity as well.
For Christine, one thing that I would like you to talk about is sort of where projects start, and how obviously I don't think anyone would disagree that we want to work equity in from the beginning, right? I think that's totally that may not have been the case 5 years ago, actually, in transportation planning, but it is now. So given that, I know you've both done a decent amount of work in sort of helping your jurisdictions categorize and prioritize things. Can you talk more about some of that and how projects start and how it's meaningful to work things in from the beginning? What does that actually mean? Christine Baker, go ahead.
Yeah, I can start. So as I mentioned, we did this robust equity analysis, and the way we look at it in Arlington, the equity lens is asking ourselves the 5 questions of who benefits, who's burdened, who's missing, how do we know, and then what do we do? And we are now at the what do we do? Because we've done this work to figure out who is disproportionately affected. And we know our equity emphasis areas in Arlington are seeing that burden. So we have escalated it as we identify projects. So we have a matrix for quick build projects. So that's anything pretty much under typically 500,000. It's hard to put a dollar amount on it because projects vary in complexity. But any kind of small scale project that we're getting done under our annual budget goes into that quick build process. So we have a matrix where every year or every time we have the opportunity to get more projects in, we rank all the potential projects we have based on the crash data that we see, whether they're in an equity emphasis area. We also look at schools, is it near schools or public facilities or senior facilities? And that helps us to prioritize those projects that are going to help, in areas that need them the most, with people who might have more burden on them. So that's how we deal with the quick build projects. And then for the larger capital projects, we do that budgeting cycle every 2 years. So we have another big matrix that takes into all these different factors. And we have pushed to make sure that safety and equity are both in that matrix and have a high weight so that that bumps up those capital projects and gets them into the budget so they can happen more quickly. And then there's the proactive element, which is new for us. And that's kind of been a baby of Vision Zero, is that we are doing a large scale inventory of all of our equity emphasis areas, like every mid-block crossing, every intersection, to make sure they at least have the baseline treatments that we would recommend for any intersection or mid-block crossing. And then getting all that signage, all those markings, adding daylighting, things like that, to make sure that we have that baseline coverage in our equity areas. So it's going to be a big undertaking, but something that we're really excited to do, because it shows that we can provide that treatment, and it will level that playing field, I think, for neighborhoods that may have been underserved in the past. I'll kick it to you, Christine.
Okay. So yeah, echo what you've said, but I'd say even backing up from individual projects, I'm working with our DDOT Office of Racial Equity, and to form a similar fancy graphic like this one. But every project that gets submitted for budgets gets evaluated according to a racial equity tool, which within that, similar to what other Christine Baker said, it has an equity score related to race, incomes, who is impacted. It asks all the right questions according to the GARE model that they have, but it also adds into that safety. Is it adjacent to or on a high injury network? How many crashes have occurred in the past few years? Other kind of factors related to that. But in terms of how a project starts and building that in from the beginning, even before we get to the budget selection process, it's built into Move DC, it's built into the Office of Racial Equity on the mayor's level. And then sort of related back to the question about our panel being all white, that office is also looking at the hiring dynamics of the district, of who gets the postings, where they're posted, and then the hiring process as well. So all of that kind of feeds into one another to get down to the project selection basis, which then looks at the neighborhood, the demographics of the neighborhood, what are the needs for that corridor in terms of bus, bike, how many people from the neighborhood are actually driving, or was this designed for commuters to get through their neighborhood as quickly as possible? And so one of the ways that we've operationalized equity and are starting to is with the TSI 2.0 model. For those that don't know, it's our transportation or traffic safety input requests. Previously, we did it on a first come, first serve basis and opened up requirements. People didn't have to go through their ANCs. So naturally, we got a high influx of requests, and neighborhoods with more access and more connection and more time to submit requests then got more safety focus and safety treatments than neighborhoods that did not have that access, privilege, power. So the TSI 2.0 was an effort to sort of operationalize equity within this, request-based program, which is sort of the more reactive side of Vision Zero and traffic safety. These requests then, from the very beginning are being looked at through this more equitable lens, where we're looking at crash patterns. People in equity zones related to income, disability, and race and ethnicity, they even get an additional score over the crash patterns that we see along with vulnerable road user trip generators, like where do we have senior centers, schools, transit stations, and then roadway characteristics to try and add in the level of risk there too. So maybe we don't see a lot of crashes, but if the risk is there and the traffic controls and the design isn't there, how can we sort of bump up the priority for those as well? So taking sort of a critical look at all of our programs and our prioritization process to make sure that equity is built into how we pick our projects, how we design our programs, and what we work on and allocate resources to.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, I've talked about this before. I am a huge fan of DC redoing the TSI process. I'm in DC, so I have some bias towards this, but when this came out, a lot of people were really upset about it because they had spent a lot of time filing TSI requests, and I don't want to negate anybody's hard work, but it was very obvious as to where a lot of those requests were coming from, and that wasn't tracking with where people were being hit or killed. So when we were preparing for this, I asked you all to can you name the least safe place in your jurisdiction? And if it's not being made to be less dangerous, what would it take?
I'll start. Alex, if you can navigate to one of my slides that includes our high injury network map. That one. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, so recently, City of Alexandria undertook a citywide crash analysis to kind of re-up our understanding of where the high crash areas in the city are. Unsurprisingly, they're pretty consistent with what we identified when we developed our Vision Zero action plan about 5 or 6 years ago. So, all of the corridors shown on this map are part of our high injury network. Duke Street is a major high crash corridor. Portions of Beauregard Street, Seminary Road. Unsurprisingly, these tend to be our higher volume, wider, faster corridors. They don't exclusively transcend underserved communities, but I think disproportionately they represent more underserved communities than they do well-served communities. So yeah, we're tackling this. It's a big undertaking to try to fix these corridors. It'll take a long time. Aside from these corridors themselves, we've also identified a series of high crash intersections. So along these corridors, where are the areas of greatest concern, and trying to tackle those first, so that we're kind of chipping away at our crash numbers every year. Most recently, we applied for a Safe Streets and Roads for All grant to do high crash intersection audits at 7 of our high crash intersections, which are primarily, the locations that we selected are primarily on the west end of Alexandria, which is where we tend to see higher rates of poverty and the like. So that's just kind of a snapshot of some of our safety issues in the city. I know that my fellow panelists have their own versions of a high injury network that I'm sure follow similar trends. So I'll let them speak to that.
Anybody else up for sharing their least safe place?
I can jump in. I think it's fair to say that Maryland 193, or University Boulevard, it has historically and unfortunately continues to, by a large margin, have the highest number of crashes, especially pedestrian bicycle crashes and fatalities, and not just in the county, but in the state and in the Washington region. So it's not a distinction that we're excited about, but it's been a challenge. It's also under the control of the state. What adds complexity to that corridor, which is definitely an inequity emphasis area, large number of individuals who are Latinx and in different other diverse communities represented. But it's also where a little project that folks may have heard of called the Purple Line is going. The design for much of the treatment, and Wade is familiar with this as well. A lot of those designs were locked in several years ago. So working with not just SHA, the Maryland Transit Administration, and the concessionaire, there's a host of players that we need to work with to try to improve that corridor and not have things fixed. But that has been a challenge. On the side, as far as part of the county, we are, and through the Safe Routes grant, trying to improve and 5 of the 7 sub-projects are within the watershed of the Purple Line. So we're at least trying to make sure that the access to the stations and to the corridor is a lot safer, but that corridor has been a particular challenge.
Yeah, as a graduate of University of Maryland College Park,
Yep.
More familiar than I would like with that part of the world.
Yep.
I do want to get at the sort of sentiment, Garrett, thank you for your question. I'm going to rephrase it a bit of just, like I said, I learned some stuff in preparing for this, having high injury network, like data and information is great. What is, I think a lot of times people perceive things as not moving fast enough, right? Or not immediately addressing like major crashes or known dangerous areas as quickly as possible. Can you talk about some of the, and anyone can go for this, I don't have any of you in mind. Can you talk a little bit about what are the challenges to actually meeting the meeting needs and also meeting public perception in the process of doing this work.
I could jump in. I think it would be, it is very, very difficult to balance the expectation piece with the, with what sometimes really needs to be done. And in Arlington, we committed when we did our Vision Zero action plan was to do this community engagement every year that focuses on perceptions. And that helps us to understand how we're doing and people, are they feeling safer? But then we're also looking at the data too. So I think it's a yes and where we want to make sure people are feeling safe, but at the same time, we are focused in on our program. We're focused in on all of the, hotspot work, the HIN work, the equity work. So it's all kind of integrated together, and that's the program. But then we do bring in that perception element, and we bring in that community feedback as like a something that kind of helps to understand the full picture, I think. And so we know when we look at data, where the real problem areas are, where the real inequities are. And then that perception data or information, or, the emails we get every day, the comments we get from people helps to ground some things. And we try to balance and just try to, having this new equity report has given us something to point to when that question comes up, when, somebody really wants something in their neighborhood, and we can say, maybe this isn't the time, this isn't the, it might not be a bad project, but we're just not going to let you jump the queue because, you don't feel safe and there's another neighborhood over here that really needs this. So we're not discounting anyone's perceptions. We're trying to integrate that with the greater picture and then try to do everything holistically, making sure we're prioritizing the greatest needs first.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I have been using my personal anecdote is that a driver hit me with their car near my house at 11th and Girard about a month ago. There's a bike lane on 11th Street. There is a protected bike lane being planned for 11th Street. The ANCs and businesses have been relatively supportive. There does seem to be some staffing stuff at DDOT and just turnover with the project manager. And this project is going to happen, right? Like this is like, it's one of those like things that I can reflect on, like being proud of my work and endorsing ANC commissioners and working closely with people in my neighborhood to support this kind of project. But it's not something that like I can say, build my protected bike lane now. It's not mine, first of all. And like, it's also not good. Like it's on the process, like the track that it's on, right? And I am often conflicted in that, like myself, in wanting to say like intervene on this thing that I know to be really bad, whether it's been like a personal experience or I can look at the data and I want somebody to do something about it. I am also burdened with the knowledge of how budgets work. So I don't think that there's there's no good answers for any of these things, but I am keenly aware of the divide between like how people feel about things and what they see versus how this is working.
If I could just interject for a second, I think, and I know we're running close on time. I think one thing that's important is for people to, especially community members and advocates, to really understand, like, that's your prerogative to advocate for your neighborhood. And I take no qualms with that. I would invite you to come and walk these communities and these streets that are getting the focus, to really experience what your fellow DC residents, your fellow Arlington, Alexandria, whatever residents are experiencing on a daily basis, and maybe don't have the connections or the ability to get the focus that you'll do. So this is really important. And I think to Garrett's question on how equity should inform the changes that are made, I say this a lot, but like good government is doing the best thing for the most people, including the people who aren't in the room, like youth, seniors, people that have children, don't have the time to go to meetings, people who, and even, people who are not here yet, the future. So building a multimodal system that meets all of our safety and climate goals is going to benefit the most people.
Yeah, I want to get to briefly, for people who care about making it harder for drivers to kill or injure others, what can they do to help you in your role, especially as staff? You're not the elected officials, you're not the appointed decision makers. So how can people make your lives either easier or challenge you in a productive way to make it so that no one hits and kills anyone?
I can touch on that. And I think it echoes a lot of what has just been said by you, Alex, and Christine Mayeur is it's all about keeping your eye on the big picture. It can be really, really tempting to get pulled in a lot of different directions and try to solve every safety issue that exists in your jurisdiction. And I know a lot of community members are extremely passionate about seeing positive changes in their community, and that's great. But again, I think echoing what Christine said, recognizing that there are too many crashes to solve all of them right away or even ever, reminding people that the goal isn't to eliminate all crashes. The Vision Zero goal is to eliminate fatal and severe crashes. And so if you were to look at a map of crashes in the city of Alexandria, you'd see crashes on almost every street in the city. Does that mean that every street in the city warrants the same level of attention? It doesn't. So just kind of keeping the big picture in mind, where are we repeatedly seeing fatal and severe crashes, and sort of encouraging staff and encouraging elected officials and encouraging, fellow community members to keep their focus on those high priority areas.
I'll jump in and say, quote Ted Lasso / the actual scholar who said this, that I'm blanking on their name, be curious, not judgmental, and recognize that we are humans and we were all hired to do the thing that you want us to do. And we're doing the best that we can with the cards that we've all been dealt. We have families, we experience the streets just like you all do. And we're the ones putting in the work to move the goals that we all support forward. So, if you have some ire, just know that I'm working for you. We're on your side.
Anybody else? Words of wisdom?
Yeah, I would say
was-
one thing. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Christine.
Nope, you go.
Yeah, I would say one thing is sometimes if people in the community or advocates who are kind of looking at this larger picture, they feel like, oh, this government's so huge, it's a $6 billion budget, it's so confusing, there's all these layers. Don't worry about that. If you just send an email during budget season to your council member, say, I care about safety, please invest more in the high energy network. That does as much as writing a 15-page long email saying all the research you've done. So don't get intimidated by the largeness of these programs, largeness of the governments, the bureaucracy, the ins and outs, the who's on what committee for the council. You can keep it simple, just say what you want and where you want to see it, and that's really going to help make an impact when they have to make those tough budget decisions every year.
Cool. I am being given a wrap-up notice. I will tell everyone, this is not the view of the people on this panel, but it is mine, which is, if you don't like somebody, you need to elect somebody else. So electoral politics are a huge component of this. Often much of the good work that we talked about today can be stymied by who's in charge and who's elected. But your constituency, make yourself known in a friendly, polite, and constructive way, and make sure that your decision makers are reflecting, what you want to see in the world. So thank you so much for everybody.